Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright. We're going to take a look at another teaching on covenant, and we're going to take a look at the teaching on how is covenant confirmed in Christ. And I want to give you 4 introductory comments to kind of focus that thought, but how is covenant confirmed in Christ? And number 1, in these pages, Professor Wright gives us a precisely structured teaching on the work of righteousness in confirming the covenant by Christ. It's a very structured presentation of the work of righteousness. It is portrayed as 3 messianic moments and 5 results of righteousness. 3 messianic moments plus 5 results of righteousness to reach the eschatological life of the believer as a worship type lifestyle. And we can abbreviate this formula under the New Testament concept of a halasterion in Romans 3:25, which tells us that Jesus is the mercy seat of atonement. So the lesson will address 2 things. It will address the soteriological place of salvation in Christ, and it'll also address the eschatological time of the believer within the Spirit. So keep those comments focused, and we're going to begin with a chart now. Let's go look at the first column, the first triad on the left. We'll look at block 1, Ke Kura Men and Confirmation. We're told that the reproach and the sins of humanity have been pressed upon the cross of Christ. It has been pressed upon the cross, and then in Romans 15:7, and because our sin is pressed upon the cross, the resurrection has also received our new life into the glory of God. Because we are pros lambano, we are taken up into the resurrection of Christ to participate in the inheritance of Lais doxon to theou. We participate and share in the inheritance of the glory of God. So we end up with a little introduction of a triad. Kind of a first look here. We got the epipipto, the fact that our sin is pressed upon the cross of Christ, and the pros lambano, our new life is taken up into the resurrection of Christ. Therefore, doxon to theou, we receive an inheritance of sharing in the glory, the doxa glory of the righteousness of God. Now note 4, it's the Abraham covenant that is confirmed in these 3 messianic moments. The covenant of the Abraham covenant is confirmed in those 3 messianic moments, resulting in 5 fulfilled aspects of righteousness. 1, the call becomes the ongoing call of Christ. Enabling becomes the power of the indwelling Spirit. Word becomes the fulfillment of Torah as the Remata, words of truth in Christ. And Yahweh's abiding presence becomes the Kyrios lordship of Christ. And promise becomes Christ as the spiritual seed of Abraham. And all of this leads to a dramatic conclusion of Romans 15:12, that Gentiles are now in Christ. They have been lifted up and also can join in the ecclesia community, and this community has eschatologically already been inaugurated in reality. The 3 messianic moments and the 5 righteousness results together reach an eschatological inaugurated reality of a kingdom of righteousness. So if we look at block 2, we'll take a look at this being put right by Christ, by the justice of Christ. And that includes knowing, gnosis, Christ's lordship brings the knowing of Yahweh to all humanity, and also it involves the kingly rule of 1 Corinthians 15:20 through 28, which quotes Psalm 110, Christ sits at the Father's right hand, Christ will reign till all enemies are under his feet. So we do have the knowledge of Yahweh, and we have the lordship of Christ as Kyrios Lord. That is the way that we are being put into the right alignment with God through Christ. Now, the knowledge of Christ and the kingly rule of Christ both serve the eschatological goal of God becoming all in all. In 1 Corinthians 15:21 and 22, we are made alive in Christ, and that's going to be the zoopoieo, the knowledge of Christ and the lordship of Christ as Kyrios, Lord, leads to zoopoieo. God has solved the problem of Adamic sin and its effects through the eschatological inauguration of the reigning rule of Christ. And so Professor Wright tells us that Christ is the fulfillment of Israel's vocation. He really does concentrate on the fact that this is a fulfillment of Israel having turned away from their vocation. It becomes taken up in the cross of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and it is fulfilled in Christ as true Israelite. Philippians 3:20, through Christ we have attained unto the citizenship in heaven. We have been adopted into citizenship in heaven, into the Urenas, through Christ. Because he is the true Israelite who has fulfilled the vocation of taking the light of the truth to the nations. So we've looked at the three messianic moments, the 5 results of righteousness, and then the concrete putting to right of creation. And all of that leads us to transformation, metaschematizo, the life of being transformed into the image of Christ. It's through wisdom. In Ephesians 1, Christ is above all principalities, all powers. He is the Kephali head over the Soma body of the church. Christ brings a divine wisdom through building the ecclesia church. The Jews believed that the Messiah would be a temple builder, and Christ does build the ecclesia church of the called out ones. Wisdom and ecclesia both result in the gift of spiritual inheritance. Ephesians 4 tells us Christ has been the one who descended, and he is the one who has ascended in order to fill all things, plerao, to fill all things, to furnish and to finish all of creation. So our inheritance is this filling of all of creation with the Spirit of Christ that is taking place in humanity and in all creation existence. So who become the new people of God? Professor Wright tells us that Paul says that the true people of God are the children of promise. The true people of God are the children of promise, the promise to Abraham, through the work of Christ the potter over the clay, in Romans 9. And then Romans 10:4 was critically important for Professor Wright. It tells us that Christ is the teleosis of the law. He is the eschatological direction of fulfilling the law. Christ fulfills the law. He is the teleosis of the law. Its end was to serve the greater purpose of reaching the full disclosure of God's plan of salvation in Christ. It was leading to that full revelation, that apocalyptic revealing. And so we're left with the concept of incorporation. Christ has gathered up Israel's identity. He has gathered up Israel's vocation into himself, and he has fulfilled that vocation so that all believers are now incorporated into Christ. All believers are incorporated into the cross, into the resurrection, and into the realm of the Spirit. And so we got a great initial triad here, but you know that everything taught by Paul always has to be concrete theology. It can't be left in the abstract. So the triad on the right is going to address the concrete aspects of this movement from confirmation through justice unto righteousness. We'll begin with block 1, the promise, obedience, and the putting to right. Christ has constituted a new promise-receiving people. Believers are incorporated into Christ as true Israelite. And then note 2, Paul's coherent soteriology evolves out of this. We can look at Romans 3. Israel's failure to fulfill its vocation after having been given the oracles of God was a failure on their part because they did not become the light to the nations as they were supposed to. However, Paul says that God did remain faithful to his aspect of the covenant through the sending of Jesus Christ. Even though Israel turned inward and did not take on their vocation of being light bearers to the nations, God remained faithful to the covenant and sent his Son. So the failed vocation is resolved in Christ through the revealed righteousness in Christ, and it has been phanerao, it has been made manifest in the apocalyptic revelatory unveiling of Jesus Christ as the teleosis of God's plan of salvation. He is the direction of the Father's plan of salvation. The methodology for this fulfillment is in Romans 5. It takes place through the obedience of Christ. The promise is fulfilled through hupakoe, and hupakoe means through Christ's attentive perception and submission to the Father. He took on the role of a servant. He took on the role of the servant and the obedience of hupakoe. Hupakoe is attentive perception and submission as a servant unto the Father. And Romans 3:24 tells us that it's through this redemptive act that the covenant is fulfilled in Christ. And the concept of apolutrosis is taken up, which means that He paid the ransom for our redemption. Therefore, all those in Christ are declared to be in the right through the event of Christ's cross and his resurrection and the impartation of the Spirit. Therefore, we have a triad that emerges in the concrete area here. First, epangelia, promise. There's a new promise-receiving people that have been constituted. Second, hupakoe, obedience, is the concrete resolution of Israel's failed vocation, the obedience of Christ unto the Father, which leads to apolutrosis, redemption through grace. So we get a very concrete triad here in the first block of epangelia, hupakoe, and apolutrosis. Epangelia, hupakoe, and apolutrosis. So let's continue looking at this concrete dimension. Let's take a look at block 2, the worship type life. We have looked at the concrete aspect on the side of Christ in block 1. Now we'll look at the concrete life on the side of the believer in block 2. Philippians 3 tells us we are those who worship in the Spirit. And a place is emphasized here by Paul. Christ is the place where Israel's destiny is to be fulfilled. Justification means being in the Messiah for Paul. To be justified, to be atoned for, means to be in the Messiah. Those who are in the Messiah have been redeemed and have been put right according to the righteousness of God. And it takes place through worship concepts, and we get very concrete depiction here from Professor Wright that we live a worship-type lifestyle through knowledge of Christ, through faith in Christ, through the potential power of Christ's resurrection, through the fellowship of Christ's sufferings, all abbreviated under La Treuo. So knowledge, faith, power, and sacrifice all become the worship-type living of the believer. Knowledge, faith, power, and sacrifice, all centered in Christ, become worship-type lifestyle. We seek to know Christ. We seek to live within Christ, His faith and our faith. We seek the power of His resurrection, His lordship. And we take up agape self-giving sacrifice. Now, Paul uses and I'm glad that Professor Wright brought this up. It's an important note, note 3 in block 2. Paul uses the genitive case when referring to Christ. It's His faith that saves us. But Galatians 3:24-29 tells us that we live a life in the Messiah. We are also baptized into the Messiah, and we do put on the Messiah as believers. Therefore, the true worship and the place in the Messiah both lead to kleronomos, heirs of the kingdom. We become those who inherit the kingdom and the doxa glory and the blessings of the kingdom as an eschatological life, which is inaugurated in our worship-type lifestyle. That comes from 2 Corinthians 1:21. We are established unto Christ. It's an ongoing process. This bobios is a being built up as steadfast and sure in Christ. It's an ongoing process. We are continually being built up in Christ, continually refined like gold, continually sanctified, so that we reflect the image of Christ and become the light bearers unto the world. So we've had a good look at concrete aspects of confirming the covenant on the side of Christ, the concrete result of the believer living a worship-type lifestyle. So that leads to the conclusions by Paul, says Professor Wright, that Jesus is the faithful Messiah for Paul. And he takes us to 3:22, where we got the concept of pisteos Christou, which is translated the faithfulness of Christ. It's mistakenly translated as faith in Christ, but Professor Wright says no, it is the genitive subjective. It is to be translated faithfulness of Christ. The faithfulness required of Israel failed, but now it is provided by the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. So the emphasis is on the faithfulness toward the vocation of salvation. It's the faithfulness of the Messiah Jesus to take up the failed faithfulness of Israel. It's the genitive subjective. And Israel was entrusted with God's oracles according to Romans 3. But Christ becomes the one as the mediating Messiah, as entrusted with the truth of the living God, the aletheia truth, as the rhemata, which that's the spoken word of Christ. The klesis call of Christ speaks the rhemata truth of Christ, the words of truth to all people. And that leads us to that concept of hilasterion in Romans 3:21-26. Christ is the true mercy seat of redemption. Christ is the faithful Israelite through redemption in Christ. and he becomes the mercy seat of atonement. So we end up with a triad of Pisteos Christou, the genitive subjective, and then the entrusting of truth, and then the reality that Christ is the mercy seat of atonement. So we've had a chance to look at the theoretical side of confirmation and the concrete side of confirmation of the covenant in Christ. And you've had those introductory comments I gave you, and I'm sure you caught it, but we had that formula of 3 messianic moments and 5 results of righteousness, leading to worship-type lifestyle as eschatological life. So we're ready now to take up our recall triad next.